My mother had visited the NICU every day for 4 days, and each time she left, my twins got sicker. It wasn't until my 7-year-old daughter said, "Mommy, why does Grandma touch their machines when you're not looking?" that we pulled the security footage and discovered she'd been slowly murdering them in the name of natural selection. I'm Bethany, and I need to tell you what happened in that NICU ward, because some stories demand witnesses. My twin boys had just died after fighting for 4 days in this world, their tiny bodies no bigger than my husband's hand. The nurses were still disconnecting the machines when my mother decided to make her announcement. "Weak mothers produce weak babies," she said, her voice carrying across the entire neonatal intensive care unit like she was still teaching her high school biology class. "This is natural selection at work. The human body knows when something isn't viable. 20 people heard her. 20 people stopped what they were doing. The nurse holding River's body actually stepped back from my mother like she'd encountered something dangerous. My husband Roland went rigid beside me, his grief transforming into something darker. But my mother wasn't finished. In nature, this maintains the strength of the species," she continued, addressing the room like we were all her students. "Animals don't waste resources on offspring that won't survive. Bethany needs to accept this was inevitable." I collapsed. Not dramatically, not like in movies. My knees just stopped working and I folded downward like paper in water. Roland caught me before I hit the floor, and I heard him shouting at my mother, telling her to get out, his voice breaking between rage and devastation. The head nurse was already moving toward us, trying to restore order to the chaos my mother had created. But then something extraordinary happened. My 7-year-old daughter, Meadow, appeared in the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be asleep at the hotel with my mother. Yet there she stood, in her rainbow pajamas, holding her little notebook where she drew pictures for her baby brothers, her small face processing the scene before her. She looked at my mother. She looked at me crying on the floor. She looked at the doctors and nurses frozen in disbelief. Then she walked straight up to Dr. Thorne, the NICU specialist who'd been caring for the twins, and tugged on his white coat. "Doctor," she said in that clear, bell-like voice that only children possess, "should I tell them what Grandma unplugged in the nursery?" The entire NICU went silent. Not the normal quiet of a hospital at night, but the absolute stillness that comes when everyone simultaneously stops breathing. My mother's face transformed in that instant, all her scholarly authority draining away until she looked like a ghost of herself, white as the hospital sheets, white as the walls, white as the blankets wrapped around my dead sons. "What did you say?" Dr. Thorne knelt down to Meadow's level, his voice gentle but urgent. Meadow opened her notebook, showing a drawing she'd made. It was simple, the way children's drawings are, but clear enough. 2 baby beds with machines. A figure that was obviously my mother, identified by the labeled Grandma and her distinctive short gray hair, and her hands on what looked like cords. "She said she was checking on River and Phoenix while Mommy and Daddy were talking to you about the surgery," Meadow explained. "But I followed her because I wanted to say goodnight to them, too." She went behind their machines and pulled things out of the wall. When she saw me watching, she said nature needed help sometimes. The charge nurse was already on the phone with security. Dr. Thorne stood up slowly, his face grave. "Mrs. Constance, I need you to stay exactly where you are." My mother tried to speak, but for once in her life, the woman who had an explanation for everything, who could lecture for hours on survival of the fittest and biological imperatives, had no words. She just stood there, caught between the door and her granddaughter's innocent honesty, while the weight of what she'd done began to settle on the room like a physical presence. Roland helped me to my feet, and I found my voice. It came out steady, which surprised me. "You killed them. You killed my babies." "I was testing them," my mother finally managed, but her voice had lost all its classroom authority. Strong babies would have survived a brief interruption in power, its basic biological principle. I plugged them right back in. Dr. Thorne's face went dark. "A brief interruption in ventilator support for 26-week premature infants could cause catastrophic stress. Their systems were already fighting to survive. Any additional trauma could trigger a cascade of complications." "Exactly what time did this happen?" the charge nurse asked, checking her charts. 2 in the morning, Meadow answered when my mother stayed silent. I know because I looked at the clock on the wall, the one with the teddy bear on it. The nurse's face confirmed what we were all beginning to understand. Both babies experienced simultaneous ventilator alarms at 2:03 a.m. We thought it was a power surge. They came back online within seconds, but both infants showed signs of distress afterward. Their vitals never fully stabilized after that incident. The security team arrived then, 2 officers and the hospital administrator. What followed was a conversation I could barely process through my grief, but certain phrases cut through: interference with life-saving medical equipment, assault on dependent persons, criminal investigation required. As they led my mother away, she turned back once. "I was trying to spare you suffering, Bethany. You were always too weak for harsh truths." Meadow stepped in front of me then, all 4 feet of her, facing her grandmother with a courage I didn't know 7-year-olds could possess. "My mommy isn't weak. She stayed awake for 4 days fighting for them. You're the weak one, Grandma. You gave up on them before they even had a chance." Those were the last words my mother heard before the elevator doors closed. I held my sons one more time that morning, their tiny bodies still warm, their features so perfect despite their size. River had Roland's nose. Phoenix had my chin. They'd lived 4 days, 17 hours, and 23 minutes. Long enough to be loved, long enough to be fought for, long enough to expose a truth about my mother that had been hiding behind academic theories and biological principles my entire life. The sun was rising by the time we left the hospital, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Meadow held my hand on one side, Roland on the other. We walked toward a future we'd never planned for, carrying a grief we'd never wanted, but also carrying something else. The knowledge that our boys hadn't died because they were weak. They died because someone decided they weren't worth saving, and that made all the difference. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was folding laundry. 24 weeks pregnant with twins, I felt the warm rush of fluid and knew immediately what it meant. My water had broken too early, way too early. Roland drove like a man possessed while I lay in the back seat, hands pressed against my belly, whispering to River and Phoenix that they needed to stay inside just a little longer. Meadow sat in her booster seat, quiet and watchful, her 7-year-old mind trying to process why we'd pulled her from school, why Daddy was running red lights, why Mommy was crying. "The babies want to come out?" she asked as we screeched into the hospital parking lot. "They need to wait," I told her, though I knew waiting might not be possible. "They're not ready yet." Dr. Thorne met us in the emergency room. I'd been seeing him since we learned the twins were high risk, but this was our first crisis. His calm voice became my anchor as he explained what would happen next. Immediate admission, steroid shots to develop the baby's lungs, magnesium sulfate to slow contractions, and then we would wait. Every hour inside me increased their survival chances. Every day was a victory. "We're aiming for 28 weeks minimum," he said, though his eyes told me even that was optimistic. "But these babies are fighters." I can see it on the ultrasound. They're already practicing breathing movements. For 2 weeks, I lived in that hospital bed. Roland brought Meadow every day after school. She'd sit beside me doing homework, occasionally putting her small hand on my belly to feel her brothers move. She'd started a notebook, drawing pictures of what she imagined they looked like. 2 tiny boys with superhero capes. She drew them, flying above clouds. "They're getting stronger in there," she'd announce with the confidence only children possess. I can tell. My mother called twice during those 2 weeks. Both conversations followed the same pattern. "Bethany, you need to be realistic about the outcomes here," she'd said during the first call. "I've researched the statistics for 24-week pregnancies. The odds aren't favorable." "I don't need statistics, Mom. I need support. I'm being supportive by being honest. Your grandmother lost 3 pregnancies, and she always said the body knows when something isn't right. Fighting nature only prolongs suffering." I'd hung up on her that day, something I'd never done before. Roland found me crying and held me while I sobbed into his shoulder. "She's wrong," he whispered. "These boys are meant to be here. I know it." The second call came the night before everything fell apart. She'd announced she was flying in from Vermont. "Someone needs to be the voice of reason," she'd said. Roland's too emotional, and you're not thinking clearly with all those hormones. Mom, please don't come if you can't be positive. I'm coming because you're my daughter. But I won't pretend this situation is something it's not. I taught biology for 30 years, Bethany. I understand how organisms survive or don't survive better than most. At 26 weeks and 1 day, the contractions broke through the medication. Dr. Thorne's face told me everything as he checked the monitors. We can't stop them anymore. The babies are coming today. The delivery room became a controlled chaos of NICU teams, 2 complete setups for 2 tiny boys who would need immediate intervention. Roland held my hand while Meadow waited with a nurse outside, still clutching her notebook. River came first at 11:47 p.m., 1 pound and 13 ounces, his cry no louder than a kitten's mew. Phoenix followed 3 minutes later, 1 pound and 11 ounces, silent but moving. They whisked them away before I could touch them, these tiny humans I'd carried and fought for, their bodies so small they could each fit in Roland's palm. "They're alive, Doctor," Thorne assured us as they worked. "They're breathing with help." That's what matters right now. The NICU became our new world. Incubators instead of cribs, wires and tubes instead of baby clothes. The boys looked impossibly fragile, their skin translucent, their eyes still fused shut. But their hearts beat steady on the monitors, and their little chests rose and fell with the ventilator's help. My mother arrived the next morning, wheeling her suitcase through the NICU doors at 9 a.m. sharp. She took one look at the incubators, at the machinery keeping her grandsons alive, and I saw her teacher, face slide into place, the one that evaluated and assessed and judged. "My God, Bethany," were her first words. Not hello, not how are you, not they're beautiful. They're smaller than I expected. How can anything that small survive? Roland's jaw tightened. "They're surviving right now, Constance." She walked closer to River's incubator, studying him like he was a specimen in her classroom. "The human body has limits. Sometimes accepting those limits is the kindest thing we can do." Nurse Waverly, who'd been adjusting Phoenix's monitors, turned around sharply. "These babies are doing remarkably well for their gestational age. We've seen much smaller babies go home healthy." My mother's smile was thin. "I'm sure you have to say that. Hope is part of the treatment plan, isn't it?" That first day set the tone for everything that would follow. My mother stationed herself in the NICU like a prophet of doom, making observations about natural selection, survival rates, and biological imperatives, while Roland and I focused on willing our sons to live. She'd arrive each morning with fresh statistics, new research about premature infant mortality, evolutionary theories about why some offspring thrive and others don't. "I'm trying to prepare you," she'd say when I asked her to stop. "Someone needs to be realistic." But Meadow watched everything with those sharp eyes of hers, drawing pictures of her brothers getting stronger, adding more details each day, as if her art could will them into existence. She watched her grandmother, too, and I should have paid attention to how quiet she got whenever my mother spoke, how she pressed closer to me when my mother entered the room. I should have known she was keeping track of everything in that careful, methodical way children do when they sense something isn't right. But I was too focused on the monitors, on the oxygen levels, on the tiny victories of each passing hour to notice that my daughter was documenting more than just her brother's fight for life. She was documenting her grandmother's war against it. Day 4 started with Phoenix struggling to breathe, his little chest pulled inward with each attempt, a sight that made my own lungs feel like they were failing. Dr. Thorne arrived at 5 a.m., his face grave as he examined the latest test results. "Phoenix has developed necrotizing enterocolitis," he explained, his words hitting me like physical blows. "It's an intestinal condition common in premature infants. Parts of his bowel are inflamed and dying. He needs surgery within the next few hours." Roland gripped my hand so tight I lost feeling in my fingers. What are his chances? With surgery, good. Without it, none. But he's very small, and the surgery itself carries risks. While we processed this, River's monitors started alarming. His oxygen saturation kept dropping despite the ventilator working at maximum capacity. The nurse adjusted settings, called for the respiratory therapist, tried everything. Nothing stabilized him for more than a few minutes. My mother arrived at 7 a.m., earlier than usual, carrying a folder. "I've been researching," she announced before even asking about the boy's condition. "There's something called comfort care that you should consider. It allows nature to take its course without prolonging suffering." "They're not suffering," I said through gritted teeth. "They're fighting." "Fighting implies a chance of winning, Bethany. Look at them objectively. Phoenix needs major surgery his body might not survive. River can't even maintain basic oxygen levels. At what point does this become cruel?" Nurse Waverly intervened, her voice sharp. "Mrs. Constance, these babies are receiving appropriate medical care. Many premature infants face these exact challenges and recover completely." My mother turned to her with that teacher look that had terrorized students for 3 decades. "And how many don't recover? How many parents sit here for weeks or months only to lose them anyway? I'm simply suggesting my daughter consider all options." "The only option I'm considering is saving my sons," I snapped. She sighed like I was a particularly difficult student refusing to understand a simple concept. "This emotional attachment is clouding your judgment. In nature, a mother recognizes when offspring won't survive and redirects her energy toward future breeding opportunities." "These aren't wolf pups in the wild," Roland said, his voice dangerously low. "These are our children. Children who are suffering because you won't accept biological reality." That's when Meadow spoke up from her corner where she'd been drawing. "Grandma, why do you want them to die?" The NICU went quiet except for the constant beeping of machines. My mother's face flushed. "I don't want them to die, sweetheart. I want what's best for everyone." "But you haven't even touched them," Meadow observed. "You look at them like they're science experiments. Mommy says love helps babies grow stronger. Maybe if you loved them, they'd get better." My mother's laugh was brittle. "Love doesn't change chromosomes or develop lung tissue. That's magical thinking." Dr. Thorne returned with the surgical team to discuss Phoenix's procedure. As he explained the process, my mother interrupted 3 times with statistics about surgical mortality in micropreemies, until finally he asked her to step outside. "I'm trying to ensure they have all the information," she protested. "You're undermining their ability to make informed decisions with selective data," he replied firmly. "Please wait in the family lounge." She left, but her presence lingered like a toxic cloud. The surgery was scheduled for 6 a.m. the next morning. Phoenix needed to fast for 12 hours prior, which meant disconnecting his feeding tube that afternoon. River would need continuous monitoring through the night as they adjusted his ventilator settings, trying to find something that worked. That evening, I asked Roland to take Meadow for dinner while I sat between my boys' incubators, singing the lullaby I'd sung throughout my pregnancy. Phoenix's tiny hand wrapped around my pinky finger, his grip surprisingly strong. River's eyes fluttered behind closed lids, responding to my voice. My mother returned around 8 p.m. "You need to eat something. You're no good. To anyone if you collapse." "I'm fine." "You're being reckless with your health." "What happens to Meadow if you make yourself sick? She needs at least one functioning parent." "Roland and I are both functioning fine." She pulled up a chair, that folder still in her hands. "I've watched this before, you know. My colleague's daughter went through the same thing, spent 4 months in the NICU, hundreds of thousands in medical bills, and the baby died anyway. The marriage didn't survive either. The guilt, the debt, the trauma. Sometimes the merciful thing is to let go early." "These are my children, not a case study from your colleague." "Biology doesn't care about your feelings, Bethany. These babies are displaying clear signs of system failure. Their bodies are telling you something. Why won't you listen?" "Because I'm their mother, not their executioner." She stood abruptly. "I'm going back to the hotel." "When you're ready to discuss this rationally, call me. Meadow wants to stay with me tonight to work on her drawings. At least someone in this family can channel their emotions productively. I should have said no. Should have kept Meadow with us. But I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and the thought of my daughter getting proper sleep in a real bed instead of a hospital chair made me agree. My mother left with Meadow around 9 p.m. my daughter clutching her notebook, promising to draw beautiful pictures for her brother's room. The night stretched ahead, Phoenix's surgery looming, River's breathing deteriorating, and my mother's words echoing in my mind like poison. The night nurse, a veteran named Patricia, checked on me around midnight. "That woman your mother?" she asked gently. I nodded. Some people see the world in terms of strong and weak, useful and useless. They think it makes them rational. But you know what I've learned in 30 years of nursing? The fighters aren't always the biggest or strongest. Sometimes they're the smallest ones with mothers who refuse to give up. At 2 a.m., both ventilator alarms went off simultaneously. The nurses rushed over, checking connections, adjusting settings. The alarms stopped as suddenly as they'd started, but both boys showed signs of distress afterward. River's heart rate spiked. Phoenix's oxygen dropped. It took an hour to stabilize them. "Probably a power surge," Patricia muttered, but she looked troubled. Strange that both machines alarmed at exactly the same time. By 3 a.m., despite our best efforts, both boys were declining rapidly. River's heart rate became erratic. Phoenix's blood pressure dropped. The medical team converged, working frantically, but I could see it in their faces. We were losing them. Dr. Thorne put his hand on my shoulder at 3:47 a.m. "I'm so sorry." And that's when my mother walked through the door, fully dressed despite the hour, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The flatline sound is nothing like in movies. It's not one long beep, but a series of alarms, each one representing a different system failing. River's heart monitor went first, then Phoenix's oxygen sensor, then everything else in a cascade of mechanical panic that brought every available nurse running. Dr. Thorne and his team worked with fierce precision. Chest compressions on bodies so small that 2 fingers were all that fit. Tiny doses of epinephrine measured in fractions. Roland stood frozen beside me, both of us watching our son slip away despite the controlled chaos of medical intervention. 20 minutes. That's how long they tried. 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours and 20 seconds simultaneously. Then Dr. Thorne stepped back, his gloved hands still at his sides, and looked at the clock. Time of death, 3:47 a.m. The nurses moved gently then, disconnecting the machines that had kept our boys tethered to this world. They wrapped River and Phoenix in white blankets with tiny blue stripes, hospital blankets that would have been too big for full-term newborns, but seemed enormous around our sons. Waverly brought them to us, placing River in my arms and Phoenix in Roland's. They were still warm, their faces peaceful, no longer straining to breathe, no longer fighting against bodies that couldn't support them. River's tiny fingers were curled into fists. Phoenix had one hand open, reaching for something we'd never know. "My babies," I whispered, and the break in my voice shattered the professional quiet of the NICU. "My sweet, brave boys." That's when my mother entered, fully dressed in her gray pantsuit despite the early hour, her face composed like she was walking into a board meeting. She surveyed the scene with those calculating eyes that had evaluated 30 years of students, taking in the wrapped bundles in our arms, the silenced machines, the crying nurses. "Well," she said, and her voice carried across the entire unit, "this is natural selection. Weak mothers produce weak babies. The body knows when something isn't viable. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nurse Patricia actually stepped backward. A father holding his own premature daughter in the next bay turned away, shielding his child as if my mother's words were contagious. Dr. Thorne's expression went from grief to shock. My mother continued, addressing the room like she was delivering a lecture. In the wild, this maintains species strength. Animals don't waste resources on offspring that won't survive. Bethany needs to accept this was inevitable. These boys were never meant to live. My legs gave out. Not dramatically, not with a scream, just a complete failure of my body to hold itself upright anymore. I folded downward, still clutching River, and Roland caught me with his free arm. Phoenix pressed between us. I heard Roland shouting, his voice cracking between rage and grief, telling my mother to get out, to leave, using words I'd never heard him say before. "You're emotional," my mother responded calmly. "Once you've processed this, you'll understand I'm right. This outcome was predictable from their birth weights alone. Patricia moved toward us, trying to guide us to chairs, while Waverly stood with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his professional composure finally cracking. Miss Constance, this is completely inappropriate. You need to leave immediately. I'm providing perspective that might help them heal instead of wallowing in preventable grief. That's when I heard the elevator ding and small footsteps running down the hallway. Meadow appeared in the doorway, still in her rainbow pajamas with unicorns on them, her feet in mismatched socks, clutching her notebook to her chest. She'd somehow convinced the night shuttle driver from the hotel to bring her, telling him it was an emergency, that her mommy needed her. She took in everything in one sweeping glance that seemed too knowing for a 7-year-old. Her parents on the floor holding her wrapped brothers, the nurses crying, her grandmother standing rigid and righteous in the center of it all, the other NICU families turning away in horror. Meadow walked past her grandmother without acknowledging her, straight to Doctor. Thorne she tugged on his white coat with one small hand, and when he knelt down to her level, she spoke in that clear, innocent voice that could cut through any adult pretense. "Doctor, should I tell them what Grandma unplugged in the nursery?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every machine in the NICU seemed to pause. Every breath held. My mother's face transformed in that instant, all color draining until she matched the white walls, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Dr. Thorne asked gently, though his eyes had gone sharp. Meadow opened her notebook, flipping to a page she'd marked with a green crayon. "I drew it so I wouldn't forget. Last night, when Grandma said she was checking on River and Phoenix while Mommy and Daddy talked to you about the surgery. She said I could come with her if I was quiet." She showed him the drawing, crude but clear in the way children's art can be. 2 rectangles representing incubators, stick figures for the babies, a taller figure labeled Grandma, with her hands on what were obviously cords. "She went behind River's machine first," Meadow continued, her voice steady like she was reciting a story she'd memorized. "She pulled something out of the wall." The machine started making noise. Then she put it back in and did the same thing to Phoenix's machine. When she saw me watching, she said nature needed help sometimes and that she was testing them. Dr. Thorne stood slowly, his face grave. "What time was this, Meadow?" 2 in the morning. I know because I looked at the teddy bear clock. The big hand was on 12 and the little hand was on 2. Patricia gasped. "The ventilator alarms, both at 2:03 a.m. We thought it was a power surge." Dr. Thorne pulled out his phone, calling security while keeping his eyes on my mother. "I need security in the NICU immediately and administration. We have a situation." My mother finally found her voice, though it came out wrong, high and strained. "This is ridiculous." "The child is confused. I was checking the machines were properly plugged in. Any interruption was momentary." "You unplugged life support for 26-week premature infants?" Dr. Thorne's voice had gone deadly quiet. "For seconds, strong organisms would survive such a brief interruption. I was proving a point about their viability." Roland stood, still holding Phoenix, and his voice came out steady and cold. "You murdered our sons to prove your sick theory about natural selection. Don't be dramatic. They were already dying. I simply demonstrated that they couldn't survive without extreme intervention." Meadow looked up at her grandmother then, and the disappointment in her young face was devastating. "You're a teacher, Grandma. Teachers are supposed to help people learn and grow. You didn't help River and Phoenix grow. You stopped them." Security arrived then. 2 officers and the hospital administrator, their faces grim as Doctor. Thorne explained what had been revealed. My mother stood straighter, clutching her folder like a shield. "This is absurd. I'm being persecuted for accepting biological reality." But the administrator was already on his phone, calling the police. "We'll need to review all security footage from the NICU for the past week. Don't let her leave." As they surrounded her, my mother looked at me one last time. "I was trying to spare you, Bethany. Watching them suffer for days or weeks only to lose them anyway. I was being merciful." I found my voice then, steady and clear despite the tears. Mercy would have been loving them for whatever time they had. Mercy would have been supporting us while we fought for them. You don't know Mercy, Mother. You only know control. The security footage was damning. The hospital's head of administration, Mr. Garrett, had it pulled within 15 minutes and displayed on the monitor at the nurses' station. We all watched in horrific clarity as my mother entered the NICU at 2:01 a.m., Meadow, trailing behind her in those rainbow pajamas. The video showed my mother approaching River's incubator first. She looked around, checking if anyone was watching, then reached behind the machine. The angle captured everything, her deliberate movements as she grasped the ventilator's power cord and pulled it from the outlet. River's machines immediately went dark. Alarms shrieked. She held the plug for exactly 8 seconds before reconnecting it. "Watch her face, Doctor," Thorne said quietly. "She's counting." He was right. Her lips moved slightly. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Testing how long before intervention would be needed, how long a strong baby should survive without life support. Then she moved to Phoenix's incubator and repeated the process. 8 seconds of darkness, 8 seconds of suffocation for a baby whose lungs were already failing. "The stress of those interruptions, Doctor," Thorne explained to the police officers who'd arrived, "would cause immediate oxygen deprivation. For 26-week preemies, even seconds without ventilator support can trigger a cascade of complications: brain hemorrhages, cardiac stress, systemic failure." Officer Martinez, a young woman with kind eyes, knelt beside Meadow. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what your grandmother said when she did this?" Meadow nodded, still clutching her notebook. "She said she was conducting an experiment that Grandpa Darwin would understand. When the machine started beeping, she said, 'See, they can't even handle 8 seconds.' Natural selection at work. Then she saw me watching and told me I was smart enough to understand that some babies weren't meant to live." "Did you tell anyone?" Officer Martinez asked gently. "I tried to tell Daddy when we got back to the hotel, but Grandma said I was dreaming, that I'd fallen asleep in the chair and imagined it. She made me hot chocolate and said if I told anyone about my bad dream, it would upset Mommy and make the babies sicker." Roland's hands clenched into fists. "She gaslit a 7-year-old to cover up attempted murder." "Murder," my mother interjected, her teacher voice trying to reassert control. "That's absurd. They lived for nearly 2 more hours. If those 8 seconds were fatal, they would have died immediately." Dr. Thorne turned on her with barely controlled fury. "The human body doesn't work like a light switch, Mrs. Constance. The stress you induced weakened their already fragile systems. Their blood pressure spiked, oxygen levels crashed, heart rates became erratic. We spent the next hour stabilizing them, not knowing we were fighting damage you had caused. By 3 a.m., their bodies couldn't compensate anymore." Mr. Garrett pulled up additional footage from the previous 3 days. There was my mother at River's incubator on day 2, adjusting something on his IV line while the nurse was distracted. Day 3 showed her lingering by Phoenix's feeding tube, touching connections she had no business touching. "Dear God," Patricia breathed, "she's been sabotaging them all along." "Not sabotaging," my mother corrected calmly. "Testing. Every organism should prove its fitness to survive. I was simply introducing normal environmental stressors." "Normal environmental stressors?" I stood, still holding River's body, my voice rising. They were premature infants in intensive care. Their entire existence was about creating an environment where they could survive. Artificial survival isn't real survival, Bethany. You've always been too sentimental to understand hard truths. That's when my Aunt Juniper's name appeared on my phone. Roland answered it for me, putting it on speaker when he heard the urgency in her voice. "Bethany, I just saw the news alert about Mother being arrested at the hospital. There's something you need to know. When you were born premature at 28 weeks, she did something similar. She convinced the doctors to reduce your interventions, said if you were meant to live, you'd live without extraordinary measures. Dad had to threaten divorce and get a court order to continue your treatment. She's always believed in this sick version of natural selection." The room absorbed this information in stunned silence. Then Juniper continued, "There's more." Remember Cousin Elena's stillbirth 5 years ago? Mother was visiting her that week. Elena always wondered why her perfectly healthy pregnancy suddenly went wrong after Mother spent time alone with her, talking about how Elena wasn't ready for motherhood. Officer Martinez had been taking notes throughout. Mrs. Rye. Constance, I'm placing you under arrest for aggravated assault on dependent persons and interference with life-saving medical equipment. You have the right to remain silent. This is ridiculous, my mother said as they handcuffed her. I'm a respected educator. I've taught thousands of students about natural selection and survival of the fittest. I was demonstrating scientific principles. Science doesn't include experimenting on premature infants, Doctor, Thorne said quietly. That's not natural selection. It's eugenics. As they led her away, my mother turned back one final time. Those boys would have suffered for weeks before dying anyway. I saved everyone that pain. Someday you'll understand I was right. Meadow stepped forward then, her small voice carrying surprising strength. No, Grandma. Someday you'll understand you were wrong. River and Phoenix didn't die because they were weak. They died because you decided they weren't worth saving. That's not nature. That's just mean. The elevator doors closed on my mother's shocked face, the last time I would ever see her outside of a courtroom. Dr. Thorne gently took River from my arms, laying him beside Phoenix on the small bassinet they'd prepared. I want you to know, he said softly, that without her interference, your boys had a fighting chance. At 26 weeks with modern care, the survival rate is over 80%. They were small, yes, but they were fighters. Their initial responses to treatment were actually quite promising. The weight of what might have been crushed down on me. Roland and I held each other, Meadow pressed between us as we stared at our sons who'd been murdered by someone who should have loved them. The NICU had gone silent except for the other babies' monitors, life continuing around our tragedy. But something had shifted in that space. Every parent held their baby a little tighter. Every nurse double-checked their equipment. And somewhere in the hospital's administrative offices, new protocols were being written to ensure no one could ever again interpret natural selection as an excuse for murder. Patricia approached us as the police finished their photos. Your boy's legacy won't be how they died, she said firmly. It will be all the babies who live because of the changes we're making. No grandparent will ever again have unsupervised access. No one will be able to tamper with equipment without immediate detection. River and Phoenix are going to save lives. I looked at my sons one last time, memorizing their faces, the curve of their cheeks, their tiny fingers. They'd lived 4 days, 17 hours, and 23 minutes, long enough to be loved completely, long enough to expose a darkness that had been hiding behind academic theories for decades, long enough to ensure that no other baby would suffer what they had suffered. That was their gift to the world, not weakness, but the strength to reveal truth, even in death. The trial lasted 3 weeks. My mother sat rigid in the defendant's chair, still lecturing anyone who would listen about evolutionary biology and survival rates. She drafted her own defense, comparing herself to pioneering scientists who were persecuted for their theories. The prosecutor had to remind the jury repeatedly that this wasn't about science. It was about a grandmother who murdered her grandsons. The security footage played on loop. Meadow testified via closed-circuit television. Her drawing entered as evidence. She'd added details I hadn't noticed before. Timestamps in crayon, her grandmother's exact words written in shaky 7-year-old handwriting. Nature needs help sometimes. That phrase haunted the courtroom. My mother received 18 months for involuntary manslaughter, though the judge made it clear he would have given more if the evidence of premeditation had been stronger. She lost her teaching pension, her reputation, everything she'd built over 30 years. The school district issued a statement distancing themselves from her actions and her interpretation of natural selection. But the real revelations came after the trial. Former students started reaching out, sharing stories. A teenage girl whose mother had miscarried after my mother suggested perhaps it was for the best since teen mothers rarely succeed. A special needs student my mother had told was proof that modern medicine interferes with natural selection. Pattern after pattern of someone who'd weaponized Darwin to justify cruelty. My Aunt Juniper drove down from Vermont with boxes of family documents. "I think you need to see these," she said, spreading them across my kitchen table. Letters from my grandmother, my mother's mother, describing how cold Constance had been, even as a child, how she'd refused to help care for a disabled cousin, saying resources should go to the healthy children, how she'd put down the family dog herself when it got sick without telling anyone, because prolonging its life was selfish. "She wasn't always this extreme," Juniper explained, "but after Dad died, she got worse. Like his death proved her point about weakness. He had diabetes, you know. She called it a genetic failure. Roland found me reading these letters at 2 a.m., tears streaming down my face. She killed them because she thought I was weak," I said. "Weak mothers produce weak babies." She was talking about me. "You're the strongest person I know," he said, pulling me close. "You fought for those boys every second of their lives." We had another child 2 years later, a daughter we named Victory. The pregnancy was terrifying. Every ultrasound, every checkup, I waited for something to go wrong. But Victory arrived healthy and full term, screaming with powerful lungs that needed no mechanical assistance. Meadow, now 9, decorated the nursery herself. She painted eagles on the walls, soaring above clouds. "For River and Phoenix," she explained, "so Victory knows her brothers are watching over her." She'd become protective in ways that broke my heart, checking on Victory multiple times each night, standing guard like a tiny sentinel. The NICU, where our boys died, transformed their policies completely. They installed tamper-proof outlets with alarm systems. Grandparents could only visit with parents present. Every power interruption triggered immediate investigation. They named it the River Phoenix Protocol. Dr. Thorne called me when they saved their first baby using the new system, catching a maintenance worker who'd accidentally unplugged a ventilator while cleaning. "Your boys did that," he said. "They saved that little girl." Nurse Waverly started a support group for parents who'd lost babies in the NICU. She asked me to speak at the first meeting. I stood before 15 grieving parents and told them the truth. My sons were murdered by someone who should have loved them, but their death exposed a truth that needed exposing. Sometimes, the greatest danger to vulnerable lives isn't their medical condition, it's the people who decide they're not worth saving. A father whose daughter had died at 25 weeks asked, "How do you forgive?" "I don't," I answered honestly. "Some things are unforgivable, but I can choose what to do with the anger. I choose to fight for better protections, better protocols, better understanding that every life has value regardless of its chances." My mother wrote me one letter from prison. "I was trying to spare you the pain I watched my colleagues endure with their failed pregnancies. Natural selection is neither cruel nor kind. It simply is. I hope someday you'll understand." I never responded, but Meadow did. Without telling us, she sent her grandmother a single drawing. 2 strong eagles carrying a weak, broken bird between them, lifting it higher instead of letting it fall. At the bottom, she wrote, "That's what love does, Grandma. It helps the weak become strong. Natural selection means we select to help nature, not hurt it." My mother never wrote again. Last week marked 5 years since River and Phoenix died. Meadow, now 12, asked to visit their graves. She brought Victory, now 3, who placed dandelions on each tiny headstone. "Blow," Meadow instructed her sister. "Send wishes to heaven." As white seeds scattered in the wind, Meadow said, "You know what I learned from all this, Mom? Grandma was wrong about everything. She said weak mothers produce weak babies, but you're strong, and River and Phoenix were strong too. They fought for 4 whole days. She said natural selection means letting the weak die, but real natural selection means the group protects its vulnerable members. That's how humans survived, not by being the strongest, but by being the kindest." Victory chased the floating dandelion seeds, laughing in that pure way only toddlers can. Meadow watched her, then looked at me. "I'm going to be a doctor," she announced. "A baby doctor, like Dr. Thorne. So no grandmother can ever do what ours did again. That's a beautiful goal, sweetheart." "It's not just a goal, Mom. It's a promise to River and Phoenix. They didn't get to grow up and change the world, so I'll do it for them." That night, I found Roland in Victory's nursery, staring at the painted eagles. Do you think they would have looked like her? He asked. I think they would have been exactly who they were meant to be, I said, just like she is. My mother was right about one thing. Nature does select, but she was wrong about what it selects for. It doesn't select for strength over weakness, cruelty over compassion. Humans survived because we selected to care for our vulnerable, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to love fiercely even when loss was likely. River and Phoenix lived for 4 days, 17 hours and 23 minutes. In that brief time, they exposed a darkness that had hidden behind academic vocabulary for decades. They saved countless future babies through the protocols their death inspired. They taught their sister that love means standing guard against those who would harm the defenseless. That's natural selection. The selection to protect, to fight, to refuse to let anyone declare another life unworthy. My boys were born fighters. They died as heroes, and their legacy lives on in every baby who survives because of the changes they inspired, in every parent who finds the strength to fight one more day, in every nurse who double-checks those connections. My mother thought she was proving they were weak. Instead, she proved they were powerful enough to change the world in just 4 days. That's the truth about natural selection. The fittest aren't those who survive. They're those who ensure others can. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to the dangers vulnerable families face, please share this video. Your share might reach someone who needs to hear that their baby's life has value, no matter how small or fragile. Comment below with your thoughts or your own experiences with those who doubted your child's worth. And please subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories of triumph over tragedy, of love conquering cruelty, and of small lives making enormous differences. Together, we can ensure that every child is seen as worthy of fighting for. Thank you for listening to River and Phoenix's story. May their brief lives continue to save others for generations to come.